Hello, my name is Colin Constance, and I'm a section percussionist with the San Juan Symphony. You may have already seen my previous videos where I talk about some of the unique historical and technical aspects of the snare drum, the tambourine, and the glockenspiel. Today I'm going to look a little bit more in depth to two other mallet percussion instruments, the xylophone and the big xylophone. Well, that's of course not its name. This is a marimba, but why is it mistakenly called the xylophone so oftentimes? Even in the back where I have a vibraphone set up, I have heard many times in my career that instrument referred to as a xylophone. Well, one reason is that many people in their grade school music classes were introduced to xylophones, these Orff instruments as they're called, and the name just kind of sticks and it's very unique, and there's not a whole lot of words that start with the letter X. So we learn that as a great word as we learn the alphabet at a young age. But it's also just a little bit more common in the orchestral world that may contribute to its popularity as a namesake and mislabeling instruments like the marimba and the vibraphone there in the back. Now, today I'm going to talk about some of the key differences, even though they do share some similarities. All mallet percussion is rooted in Eastern Asia, where we have a lot of archaeological sites that have shown various primitive versions of mallet instruments made from things like wood, metals, sometimes stone. I've even seen bone as a source of the bars, whereas today it's pretty much a standard metal, wood, or a synthetic version that imitates wood. For example, this is Keylon, made by the Musser Company. Other obvious similarities are the general structure or shape of the instrument. They are based off of the piano keyboard. If you look at old pictures, you actually can find other versions of layouts. My favorite is a diamond-shaped one that goes like this away from the player and had 4 different rows of bars that you would play. So it sort of worked for certain types of playing, but ultimately it was confusing. So we just went with the old traditional piano, or in the older times even then, the harpsichord layout, and that's worked quite well for many decades and centuries since. Now, the key differences here are really in how they sound, though you can tell a clear difference in size of the instruments. The size is different in part due to their historical nature. When Eastern Asian trade routes made their way to the African continent, they brought these primitive versions of keyboard instruments to the people of Africa, where it became a solo instrument. So another unique shape of early xylophones, in fact, you can still find these in Africa today, are curved single-row barred instruments that were played by a sitting person and done in a soloistic nature. And the nature of this layout and the shape of the instrument, as well as the mallets used to play, were very complementary of the very rhythmic, and I should say even polyrhythmic aspect of much of African music. Well, the African instrument made its way across the Atlantic Ocean via the slave trade to the New World, where it blended with the indigenous peoples and the plant life that existed there. That rosewood that's so popular as a source of material today was available in Central America, where this is actually the national instrument of at least half of the countries in that part of the world. Well, it grew in size in part because they intended for this instrument to be played in an ensemble setting. Anywhere from 2, 3, 4, up to 5 players would do work as a marimba band, which later became apparent to the world in the early 20th century. These marimba bands began touring the United States and Europe, playing their traditional style music, as well as really fun transcriptions of well-known orchestral works that helped it gain a foothold on the world scene. So apart from these general range issues, you can see the 2.5 to 4 octave xylophone is a little shorter than the traditionally 4 to 5.5 octaves marimba, but it's the tuning that really defines the difference here. Theoretically, I could make a xylophone as big as a marimba, or a marimba as small as a xylophone if I wanted, but the tuning is the key. Now, I'm no scientist, but I can tell you a little bit about this to help you understand. If I play C natural, mostly what you're going to hear is C natural, but you're going to hear a little bit of these overtones or these harmonics that are inside in little bits that fundamental pitch letter C. I'm adding a G, a fifth above the root note, which you will hear in subtle ways inside that initial pitch. That tuning is different than the marimba, where I play that same pitch letter C, but you're going to also hear the octave C above that and the 10th above that, which is E natural. Do that one more time. That creates a different, more blending sonority that helps to define this instrument as different from the xylophone. Now, of course, you see me using different mallets. Traditionally, the xylophone is going to have a hard rubber or a plastic, whereas the marimba is going to have a yarn. And these two different implements will help grab more of those characteristic tones out of the instrument and put it into the ensemble to define them as unique versions of a similar instrument. Now, I mentioned a little bit about the history. The proximity of Africa to Europe allowed the xylophone to gain a foothold faster in the European civilizations. We start to see references to this as early as the 1500s, both in music as well as art. And then Camille Saint-Saëns comes around in the late 1800s with his Danse Macabre and uses the xylophone to imitate death. You may have seen images of skeletons using xylophones as instruments, or I recall as a kid watching The Lion King. In the song Be Prepared with Scar and the hyenas, you see a hyena actually playing somebody's skeleton, and it sounds like a xylophone in the recording. He later redid that actually in his Fossils movement of Carnival of the Animals with a similar melody to once again recreate that imagery that's become so popular in our legacy. The marimba, on the other hand, as I mentioned, took a little longer. It wasn't until the 20th century that these marimba bands started to tour. And that gave it a slow foothold, but it took another person, Claire Omar Musser, whose namesake we see on these two instruments here, that used the marimba band on steroids, where he had 100-person marimba orchestras at the Chicago World's Fair in the early 20th century. And that, once again, gave another foothold to people understanding the capabilities of this beautiful instrument here. Well, the xylophone had another advantage. It was smaller, it was cheaper, it was more accessible for orchestras to add because of limited budgets or perhaps space on the stage to put a xylophone in there versus the marimba. But another really important difference is the advent of recording technology. If you think about early recordings, they have low fidelity. In other words, it was hard to hear instruments as they really were in live action onto the recording venue. The xylophone, being short in nature, articulate and high-pitched, really sounded quite similar on a bad recording as it did in the live concert hall. So percussionists of the age, George Hamilton Green, Teddy Brown, you can go YouTube him right now and see what I'm talking about. They were able to gain a lot of notoriety and even could sell out audiences of 4, 5, 6, 7,000 people coming to see what was at the time essentially a rock star instrument in the xylophone. Of course, today it's not quite the same. The marimba is the thing that's become more popular as a solo instrument because of the advent of four-mallet playing. Four mallets is when you shove 2 mallets in each hand. And yes, it's super awkward if I kind of give you some close-up angles. It's awkward, it's quite painful to be honest, but it allows a percussionist the chance to become more of a musician. I love playing triangle, the castanets. These are fun instruments. They have great sounds, but they don't allow me as a musician to develop things like phrasing and shaping, awareness of chord progression and scales. The marimba or the vibraphone, as I mentioned there in the back, were key ways for percussionists to develop those musical skills. Even if you wanted to be an orchestral timpanist or a jazz drum set player, you need to get some skills on these four-mallet instruments to be able to keep up with the expectations of these high-level ensembles like a professional orchestra. So to demonstrate some of these differences, I'm going to be performing for you 2 different solos. Now, these are all public domain, the things you can go look up yourself if you want to follow along with the sheet music. But because orchestral percussion developed fairly late compared to other instruments, we hear transcriptions as a main source of solo material for the xylophone and the marimba. First, you're going to hear me play a xylophone work entitled Sonata No. 3, the Allegro Movement 2 in F major by George Frideric Handel. This is originally a violin sonata played with usually a piano or at the time harpsichord accompaniment, played in a Baroque style. Written in 1732, I hope you enjoy the sonata, the Allegro from Sonata No. 3. fun piece. I actually learned that as a 7th grader when my band director made me learn a mallet solo. She wanted me to become a well-rounded percussionist, and I'm really grateful that that push was made. I love playing drums, but mallet percussion, again, is where we become musicians, which is so important for us to be successful, again, in the modern demands of professional ensembles. Well, to highlight the differences from that Baroque xylophone solo for the violin originally, I'm going to be playing for you next a marimba solo originally written for piano by Felix Mendelssohn. This is an early Romantic era piece, so you'll notice stylistically it's a different tune, not to mention the use of the four-mallets and a lot of rolling. Rolling is when I'm going to have fast motion of two sounds at once, or sometimes one sound, because mallet percussion doesn't sustain very long. We have to do these rolls to create the illusion of duration in our sound. So you'll hear a lot of that in this beautiful piece, Song Without Words, which is from book number 2. This is the 3rd piece in that book in E major, The Song Without Words by Felix Mendelssohn. I hope you've enjoyed learning a little bit about important differences between the marimba and the xylophone, as well as I hope that you've been entertained a little bit between these two different solos. Enjoy this wonderful marimba chorale.